Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to The Missing Dots. Today on The Missing Dots, we are opening the door to an intellectual storm that not everyone has the courage to face. One of the most famous commentaries on the Quran, Tafsir Ibn Kathir, a work that has shaped Sunni thought for centuries. But today, we are placing this foundation under a microscope. Did Ibn Kathir truly make the Quran easier to understand, or did his words create an entirely new forest of questions? Was his scholarship a genuine pathway to understanding divine revelation? Or did the science, culture, and beliefs of his era blend into his interpretations and reshape the meanings of the Quran? Today, we will also examine the criticisms raised by atheists, ex-Muslims, and even Muslim scholars themselves, and then explore the defenses offered by classical and modern Islamic scholarship. This is not just a conversation, this is an intellectual trial. We are not here to judge Ibn Kathir, we are here to understand his work without fear, without bias, driven only by the pursuit of truth. Welcome to The Missing Dots, where we ask the questions others hesitate to ask.
It really is a heavy door to open. I mean, I'm glad we're taking our time with this.
Yeah, so am I. And if you are listening to us right now, I just want you to, slow down for a second. Imagine you're sitting with us in a quiet mosque courtyard. The afternoon prayer finished, like a while ago.
The crowds are gone.
Exactly. Most of the people have gone home. The sun is getting lower, casting those long, quiet shadows across the stone floor. There's no rush. No one is looking at their phone.
Right, just, pouring a cup of tea.
Right. Just pouring some tea and having a real honest conversation about something that carries a massive amount of weight.
That is exactly the right setting for this.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about Ibn Kathir's commentary, we're not talking about a normal book.
No, not at all.
It's a monument. You can walk into almost any mosque in almost any country on earth, and you will find these volumes sitting on the shelf.
Yeah, people quote it every Friday.
They do.
Yeah.
But it's kind of strange how rarely we stop and ask, well, who was the actual human being holding the pen?
Right. What was happening outside his window when he was writing these words?
Exactly.
We have this habit, I think, of treating historical books as if they just dropped out of the sky yesterday.
Totally, perfectly formed.
Yeah, perfectly formed. But Ibn Kathir was a man who lived a very specific life. He lived from, 1300 to 1373?
Yeah, 1300 to 1373, mostly in Damascus.
Right. And if you look at the history of that time, the Mamluk period, this was not a peaceful courtyard era. It was actually terrifying.
Oh, it was a world entirely defined by trauma.
Yeah.
And anxiety. If we really want to understand his mind, we have to understand the nightmare that his society had just lived through.
Set the stage for us. What kind of nightmare?
Well, just a few decades before he was born, in 1258, the Mongol Empire swept through and completely destroyed Baghdad.
And Baghdad wasn't just like a regular city back then.
No. It was the center of the world. It was the intellectual and political heart of Islamic civilization.
Right.
The history books describe the rivers of Baghdad literally running black with the ink of all the books that were thrown into the water.
Cool.
And then running red with the blood of the scholars and civilians. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
The Abbasid Caliphate, which had stood for centuries, was just gone, wiped out.
So I try to imagine what that does to the psychology of a civilization. If you're a scholar growing up in the shadow of that in nearby Syria, you must feel like the world is literally ending.
Yeah.
Like everything you know is just about to be erased.
That is the exact feeling. And, it wasn't just the memory of the Mongols either. During Ibn Kathir's actual lifetime, there were still crusader states.
Really? Still?
Yeah, conflicts near the coast. And worse than that, in the late 1340s, the Black Death swept through Damascus.
Oh, wow.
Half the city died.
Half?
Yeah. So he's living in a world of constant physical threat, disease, political instability. And the Mamluks who ruled Damascus, they were a military caste of former slave soldiers.
So it was a very harsh environment.
Very harsh, very militarized.
Okay, so physical survival is clearly on everyone's mind. But what fascinates me is the intellectual survival.
Right.
Because from what I understand, it wasn't just the physical borders that were fractured. The theology was completely fracturing from the inside too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Damascus at that time was an absolute battlefield of ideas. You had so many different factions fighting over what Islam was actually supposed to be.
Give me a sense of the landscape. Who is fighting who?
Well, the biggest arguments were really about reason versus tradition.
Okay.
On one extreme, you had groups influenced by the Mutazili school.
The rationalists.
Exactly, the extreme rationalists.
Yeah.
Their basic philosophy was that human logic and reason are a gift from God. And so if a religious text seems to contradict human logic, well, then logic wins, and you have to reinterpret the text.
I can see how that would make the traditional scholars very nervous.
Extremely nervous, especially because, a few centuries earlier, the rationalists actually had political power.
Wait, they did?
Yeah, and they started an inquisition. They tortured traditional scholars who refused to agree with their philosophical views.
Oh, wow. So there was real bad blood there.
Deep, deep bad blood. Then, sort of in the middle, you had the Ash'ari school, which tried to blend logic with tradition.
Okay.
And on the other side, you had the strict traditionalists. They said, no, human logic is flawed. The text wins every single time, exactly as it's written.
And Ibn Kathir was firmly in that traditionalist camp.
Very firmly. I mean, he was studying under some very heavy hitters.
Ibn Taymiyyah, right. That's the famous one.
Yes. Ibn Taymiyyah was his teacher.
Yeah.
And he was a brilliant, fiercely traditionalist scholar. He actually spent time in prison because he refused to compromise his views.
Right.
Ibn Kathir also studied under massive historical and hadith scholars like al-Dahabi. These men were just obsessed with preserving the original, authentic tradition.
Thinking about this environment, it actually makes total sense. I want to try and put this in a way that relates to how we feel today.
Okay.
Because we live in an era of information overload.
Oh, for sure.
If you open your phone, you get 1,000 different opinions, 100 different arguments. Now imagine you are Ibn Kathir. You look out the window and you see foreign armies.
Plagues.
Plagues, exactly. And you see your own religious scholars tearing the theology apart into 100 different philosophical factions.
Yeah.
If I'm in that situation, I'm not trying to build some creative, airy new building. I'm trying to build a bunker.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. I want a fortress. Isn't that what his commentary really is? A theological fortress to protect the religion from completely dissolving.
That is a very, very accurate way to understand his motivation.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't sit down to write this because he wanted to be famous.
Right.
He wrote it because he was terrified that the truth was being lost. He looked at the older commentaries on the Quran and he felt they were completely overgrown with weeds.
You kind of weeds.
Well, some of them were full of Greek philosophy. Others were full of, random myths and legends. He wanted to strip all of that noise away.
So he really just wanted to get back to the original source code.
Precisely. His entire worldview was built on a concept called naql, which means transmitted evidence. You only believe what was physically passed down from the Prophet and his companions.
Okay.
He was deeply suspicious of aql, which is speculative human reason.
Got it.
He felt that relying on your own intellect to figure out God's word was dangerous and, arrogant.
Which brings us to a really interesting point.
Yeah.
If you are building a fortress and you're terrified of bad information getting in, how do you decide what bricks to use?
Right.
How did he actually figure out what was authentic transmission and what was just, I don't know, some guy making things up 200 years ago?
Well, he had a very strict system. He established a 4-step hierarchy for understanding any verse in the Quran, and he followed it religiously.
Okay, let's walk through this process. If he's looking at a verse, what is step 1?
Step 1 is the safest place, the Quran explaining the Quran. He believed the text is a unified whole. So if a verse is vague in chapter 2, maybe there's a verse in chapter 20 that explains it perfectly.
That makes total sense. You let the author explain the author.
Exactly. But if the Quran itself doesn't clarify the verse, he moves to step 2.
Which is?
The Sunnah, the authentic sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Because, the Prophet's job was to explain the revelation.
Okay, still very clear. But what if there is no direct quote from the Prophet about that specific verse?
Then he moves to step 3, the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet.
Now, why do their words carry so much weight? I mean, they were just regular men and women, right?
They were, but they had one thing no one else in history will ever have.
They were in the room.
Yes. They witnessed the exact historical moment a verse came down. There is a whole science called Asbab al-Nuzul, the reasons for revelation.
Right.
If a verse says, fight them, a modern reader might ask, fight who? But a companion would say, I was standing there on that specific Tuesday when the Meccan army attacked us. And that is what the verse is talking about. They knew the context.
So they are the primary eyewitnesses to the context. That leaves step 4.
Step 4 is the Tabi'un, the successors.
The next generation.
Yeah. These are the people who learned directly from the companions. Scholars who dedicated their lives to memorizing what the companions taught them.
Okay.
Only after exhausting those 4 levels Would Ibn Kathir even look at Arabic grammar or poetry to figure out a word?
Yeah.
He absolutely hated something called Tafsir Ibn
Which means what exactly?
interpretation based on personal opinion. Reading a verse and saying, well, my personal feeling is that God means this.
Yeah.
To Ibn Kathir, that was a crime.
And this is where I really want to push back, or at least, voice the frustration that I know a lot of people feel today.
Sure.
If you're a modern person reading this strict system feels incredibly restrictive.
It does.
If we completely lock out human reason, if we say we can only rely on what a group of men said 1,400 years ago, and my own mind has no authority, don't we trap the text in the past?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't a person living today have the right to look at the text and apply their own intellect to their own modern problems?
It's a completely natural reaction. It feels very restrictive. But to understand his mindset, you have to look at the theology behind it.
Okay.
The core question for him was this: how can a human being with a brain that is flawed, biased, and limited by time possibly interpret the infinite eternal intent of God?
His answer would be, you can't.
Right. You cannot invent meaning. You can only discover what was already given.
Wow. It's almost like he viewed interpretation as like archaeology.
Oh, I like that.
You don't build the artifact, you just carefully brush the dirt off what is already buried in the ground.
That is a wonderful way to phrase it. And traditional scholars point out that this wasn't an anti-intellectual process. He wasn't telling people to, turn their brains off.
Right, because verifying all this takes work.
An unbelievable amount of intellectual genius. The process of verifying all these historical reports. He relied heavily on the science of isnad.
The chains of transmission.
Yes. And the discipline used to verify these chains is called jar wa ta'dil. It literally translates to the criticizing and validating of men.
I always hear about this, but I want to understand the actual mechanics of it. How does a guy sitting in a room in Damascus in the 1300s verify if a quote from the year 650 is actually true?
It's hard to imagine now.
Right. There's no internet. There's no database.
It is actually staggering when you look at how they did it. It's like playing a multi-generational game of telephone, but having a massive FBI background file on every single person who ever whispered the message.
That is exactly what I'm trying to picture. Walk me through a hypothetical background check.
Okay, let's say Ibn Kathir has a report. The text says, Zayd heard from Umar, who heard from Ali, that the Prophet said this.
Okay.
Ibn Kathir doesn't just read the quote. He goes to a vast library of biographical dictionaries. This goes to Rijal literature, the books of men.
Got it.
These books contain the biographies of tens of thousands of narrators.
But who wrote those books?
Earlier scholars who spent their entire lives traveling on horseback from city to city, interviewing people.
Wait, they actually rode horses for months just to check on one guy?
Yes. A scholar might travel for 3 months from Yemen to Iraq just to ask a village about one specific narrator. They would ask, did this man Zayd pray on time? Did he ever lie when he was selling sheep in the market?
Oh, wow.
When he got old, did his memory start to slip?
So they were auditing their personal lives?
Completely. Checking their moral character and their mental capacity. And they also checked the dates.
To make sure they actually overlap.
Exactly. They would look at the chain and say, wait, Zayd says he heard this from Umar. But our records show Umar died in the year 700, and Zayd wasn't born until 705. They never met. This chain is broken.
And they would just throw the report out.
Throw it out.
That is incredible. The sheer volume of data tracking is mind-blowing for that era.
It really is.
Yeah.
So when Ibn Kathir is building his fortress, he is using bricks that have gone through this intense, almost mathematical level of scrutiny.
I deeply respect the rigor of that. I think this leads us right into the biggest problem modern readers face when they open his book.
Good.
Well, if your entire system relies entirely on pulling reports from the 7th and 8th centuries, you aren't just pulling the religious theology.
Yes.
You are dragging their science, their view of the universe, and their culture right along with it. And this is exactly where the loudest criticisms from atheists and ex-Muslims come from today.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right.
When modern critics look at Ibn Kathir, the flashpoint is almost always science and cosmology.
Right.
Because he relies on historical transmissions to explain physical phenomena, he inevitably ends up describing the universe the way people in the Mamluk era or earlier understood it.
And there is one specific verse that comes up in every single debate.
Q18.86.
Chapter 18, Surah Al-Kahf, verse 86. The story of Dhul Qarnayn.
The setting of the sun.
Yes. For those who aren't familiar, the verse describes a great king, Dhul Qarnayn, traveling to the furthest western edge of the earth And it says he found the sun setting in a muddy spring, or like a dark, murky body of water.
Right.
Now, if I'm a teenager today and I'm learning about astrophysics in school, and I go home and read this commentary, it creates a huge crisis.
Absolutely.
Because we know the sun is a giant star millions of miles away. It doesn't shrink down and fall into a mud puddle on Earth.
No, it doesn't.
When critics read how Ibn Kathir handles this, they say, look, this is proof that the text is just a 7th century myth, and these 14th century scholars really believe the sun fell into a physical spring.
Right.
How do Islamic scholars actually deal with this without just, completely denying modern science?
It is a profound crisis of faith for many people, which is why academic and traditional scholars have spent a lot of time addressing it.
I imagine.
There are two major ways scholars explain what is happening here. The first is based on phenomenological language.
Phenomenological, which means describing things based on human perception.
Exactly. And I mean, we do this all the time.
Right.
If you open the weather app on your phone right now, it will tell you the exact time of sunrise and sunset. But scientifically, we know the sun is not moving up or down.
Earth is rotating.
Right. But we still use the language of human perception because it's how we experience reality.
So the argument is that the Quran is doing the same thing.
Yes. Defenders point out that the Quran says he found it setting in a muddy spring. It is describing Dhul-Qarnayn's visual experience.
Like an optical illusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He traveled as far west as he could go on land, maybe hitting a coastline or a dark sea, and as he looked at the horizon, it appeared to him as if the sun was sinking into the dark water.
Okay.
The Quran is telling a moral story about his journey, not making an astrophysical claim about the solar system.
That makes perfect sense for that specific verse. I can accept the language of perception, but what about the broader picture?
What do you mean?
Because Ibn Kathir also talks about the structure of the universe in very literal terms. He talks about the Earth being stationary and the sun orbiting around it. He talks about the 7 heavens as if they're physical structures.
Right.
You can't just call all of that visual perception.
No, you can't. And that brings us to the second defense that scholars use, which involves understanding the 14th century intellectual horizon.
Help me picture this horizon. What did the universe look like to him?
Okay, so to Ibn Kathir, and to literally every educated person in the world at that time, whether they were in Damascus, Paris, or Beijing, the universe operated on Ptolemaic cosmology.
Ptolemy, okay.
Imagine the Earth as a solid, unmoving rock hanging right in the center of a giant room. Surrounding the Earth are massive, invisible, physical glass domes or spheres layered inside each other.
Glass domes.
Yeah. The moon is attached to one glass sphere, the sun is attached to another, the stars to another. And these massive glass spheres rotate around the stationary Earth.
So when he reads a verse about the sun moving, his brain instantly pictures it sliding along its glass dome around the Earth.
Yes, because that was the undisputed, cutting-edge science of his day.
Right. He wasn't making it up.
Not at all. He was a brilliant theologian, but he was not an astronomer with a telescope. Modern academic defenders argue that it is deeply unfair, they call it anachronistic, to judge a 14th century medieval scholar because he hadn't read Copernicus.
Because Copernicus hadn't written it yet.
Exactly. So we shouldn't expect him to have 21st century science.
Yeah, that's fair.
And more importantly, classical scholars didn't draw a hard, sharp line between science and religion the way we do today. They viewed all knowledge as one connected fabric.
Oh, that's interesting.
So when Ibn Kathir needed to explain the physical world, he just borrowed the best science he had at his disposal. The goal of his commentary wasn't to teach orbital mechanics. The goal was hidayah.
Moral guidance.
Yes. He wanted to show the majesty of God's creation. The fact that the scaffolding he used to explain that majesty was made of medieval Ptolemaic science doesn't mean the theology inside the building is wrong.
I see. So the way forward for a modern reader is to mentally separate the eternal theological message from the temporary 14th century scientific scaffolding.
Exactly.
I think that is a very fair historical defense, but it makes me wonder about something else.
Sure.
If he was borrowing the science of his time, how well did he filter out the myths and legends of his time? Because, his whole mission statement was to clean up the commentary tradition, right?
That was a goal, yes.
He wanted to rely strictly on authentic chains.
Yes, he did. And this leads us to perhaps the most fascinating paradox in his entire massive work.
Which is?
It is the issue of the Israiliyat.
The Judeo-Christian traditions. Tell me what those are and how they got into the Muslim world.
Well, over the centuries, as the Islamic Empire expanded, many Jewish and Christian scholars converted to Islam. men like Kab al-Fadar in the early generations. When they converted, they brought their immense knowledge of the Bible, the Torah, and local folklore with them.
Naturally.
Right. So when Muslims would read a short story in the Quran, they would often ask these converts for the longer backstory. Slowly, over hundreds of years, these biblical stories in Jewish folklore, the Israiliyat, got mixed into the Islamic commentaries.
And Ibn Kathir was trying to clean that up.
Yes. In the introduction to his Tafsir, he is very aggressive about this. He criticizes earlier scholars, like the famous historian al-Tabari, for being way too loose and including tons of these unverified myths.
Okay.
Ibn Kathir says clearly, we are only going to rely on authentic Islamic transmission.
He didn't actually do that, did he?
Yeah.
Because if you read his books, they are still full of these Judeo-Christian stories.
They are. There are hundreds of them.
So how does a man who is so obsessed with strict rules and FBI-level background checks justify writing down stories that he knows are probably myths?
He justified it by creating a three-tier sorting system. He believed he could control the material if he categorized it.
Walk me through the tiers.
Tier 1. If the Judeo-Christian story completely matches what Islam teaches, you can accept it as extra supporting evidence.
Okay.
Tier 2. If the story contradicts Islamic theology, you absolutely reject it and throw it out.
Okay, that makes sense. So what is the problem?
The problem is Tier 3, the neutral category.
Neutral.
Yeah, these are stories that don't confirm or deny anything important. For example, the Quran mentions young men hiding in a cave with a dog.
Right, the sleepers of the cave.
Exactly. But the Quran doesn't give the dog's name. It's irrelevant to the moral. But some Israiliyat folklore says, by the way, the dog's name was Kitmir.
So what does Ibn Kathir do with that?
He writes it down. He includes these neutral details just to add historical color or to flesh out the narrative. But he adds a disclaimer.
A disclaimer.
He tells his readers, I'm including this, but do not base your religious beliefs on this because we don't know if it is true.
But wait, I have to stop and think about how dangerous that is in practice.
It is very dangerous.
If you are compiling the ultimate guide to the Word of God, and you know a story is just random folklore, why even include it?
Right?
It feels like putting a warning label on a bottle of contaminated water, putting it in the fridge, and expecting people not to drink it. Eventually, someone is going to lose the label and just drink the water.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
And it is exactly what modern academic critics say about his work.
Really?
Yes. They point out that by including these stories in his massive authoritative book, he accidentally gave them a stamp of legitimacy.
Because lay people don't read the intro.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lay people reading his books centuries later didn't read his technical introduction. They just saw the story and said, well, Ibn Kathir wrote it, so it must be divine truth.
Can you give me an example of a story where this actually causes theological trouble?
The most famous example is the story of Prophet David and Uriah.
Oh, I know this from the Bible. Tell me how it plays out in the Islamic texts.
Well, in the Quran, sort of sad, there is a very brief, vague mention of two men climbing a wall to bring a dispute to Prophet David about some sheep.
Right.
David makes a quick judgment, realizes it was a test from God, and repents. That is all the Quran says.
Very straightforward.
But the biblical tradition, which was brought in through the Israiliyat, tells a much darker story. It says David saw Bathsheba bathing, wanted her, and deliberately sent her husband Uriah to the front lines of a war to be killed so he could take her.
Right. But in Islamic theology, prophets are supposed to be protected from committing major horrific sins like murder and adultery.
Exactly. There is a massive theological clash. Now, Ibn Kathir knows this.
So why include it?
Because he is acting as a historian, compiling what earlier Muslims discussed. He includes references to some of these longer narratives. He pushes back against the worst parts of it, but the material is still sitting there in his commentary.
Just sitting there.
Yeah. Critics argue that by doing this, he compromises his own strict system.
Does he ever just draw a hard line and say, absolutely not, I refuse to write this down?
He does, and traditional scholars emphasize this heavily to defend him. They point out that he wasn't just blindly copying.
Give me an example of that.
The best example is the incident of the Garanik, which people in the West usually know as the Satanic Verses story.
Right. This is a very controversial historical claim.
Yes. There were historical reports circulating that early in his mission, the prophet was tripped by Satan into momentarily uttering verses that praise the pagan idols of Mecca.
Wow.
Some earlier commentators actually included this story to explain certain verses. But Ibn Kathir brings the absolute full hammer of his hadith science down on this.
He doesn't hold back.
Not at all. He analyzes every single chain of transmission for this story, proves that every single one is broken or fabricated, and completely destroys the narrative. He refuses to entertain it.
Okay, so that shows his filtering mechanism did work when the core theology of the religion was under threat.
Yes, he drew a red line.
But I find this fascinating because that exact same strict filtering mechanism, his total reliance on what was transmitted and his total rejection of using human logic, leads us directly into what might be the biggest internal war in Islamic theology.
Oh, without a doubt.
The debate over how we understand God himself.
Yes. We are moving away from historical criticisms now and stepping into deep theology. This is where Muslim scholars themselves argue bitterly.
Let me set the scene for this. When you read the Quran, there are verses that describe Allah using words that sound very physical, very human.
Right.
It says Allah has a hand or a face, or that Allah ascends the throne. Throughout Islamic history, there are two major ways scholars try to understand this without accidentally believing God is a giant human being.
Yes. The vast majority of historical Sunni scholarship lean toward the Ash'ari or Maturidi schools.
The ones who blended logic and tradition.
Right. They were rationalists in this regard. They used a concept called ta'wil.
Which means metaphorical interpretation.
Exactly. An Ash'ari scholar looks at the verse that says God's hand is over their hands, and their logic kicks in. They say, well, God is infinite and has no physical body, therefore hand must be a metaphor.
It actually means God's power or God's blessing. That feels very safe and logical. You prevent people from picturing a physical body. But Ibn Kathir did not like this at all, did he?
No, he violently disagreed with it. Ibn Kathir, following his teacher Ibn Taymiyyah, belonged to the Athari school, the traditionalists.
Oh.
They completely rejected ta'wil. They said turning God's words into metaphors is a massive overstep of human arrogance.
But hold on. If you reject the metaphor, doesn't that mean you take it literally?
Oh.
Because the critics of the Athari school say that if you say God literally has a hand, you are committing anthropomorphism. You are turning God into a physical creature.
It is a razor-thin wire they are walking. Ibn Kathir argued that you must affirm the exact word the Quran uses, but with a specific condition, bilakif.
Without asking how.
Yes.
I want to make sure I truly understand this because it feels like a paradox. How do you say hand without picturing a hand? I need an analogy here.
Okay, think about it like a profound surrender of the intellect. It is called tafwid.
It's like, imagine a two-dimensional stick figure drawn on a piece of paper.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And a three-dimensional human hand reaches down and touches the paper.
Right.
The stick figure cannot possibly comprehend what a 3D hand is. It has no depth perception. So the stick figure just says, a hand touched me. But it doesn't try to draw it because it knows its 2D brain will get it completely wrong.
That is a phenomenal analogy. That is exactly what tafwid is.
Wow.
Ibn Kathir is saying, yes, God said he has a hand. I affirm the hand, but I refuse to picture it.
I refuse to ask if it has fingers.
Exactly. I refuse to compare it to a human hand, and I also refuse to change the word to power.
Because changing the word implies you know better than the author.
Exactly. He felt the rationalists were putting words in God's mouth. If God meant power, he would have said power.
Okay, I see the intellectual humility in that. It's actually a very deep philosophical stance about the limits of human cognition.
It is. But Ash'ari critics argue that this stance is too dangerous for everyday lay people.
Why dangerous?
Because a scholar might understand the nuance of bilakif, but an uneducated person in the street is just going to picture a giant man in the sky.
Ah, I see.
So the debate is really about how much you trust the masses to handle ambiguity.
That is a great transition, actually, because it brings up how everyday people use this book.
Hmm.
We have talked about abstract theology, but what happens when this strict methodology hits everyday human life? Ethics, laws, punishments.
That is the real challenge.
Right. This is the issue modern readers struggle with the most.
We have to look at how Ibn Kathir handled weak hadiths and how his social rulings translate to the modern world.
Let's start with the weak hadiths. We talked earlier about his FBI-level background checks.
Dijar wa ta'dil, yes.
He was a master of it. But even his biggest defenders, like the famous modern hadith scholar Al-Albani, admit that Ibn Kathir sometimes included weak, dave, or even totally rejected munkar hadiths in his commentary.
Who did?
Why? If his system was so strict, how did the weak ones slip in?
Because classical scholars had different standards depending on the topic. It wasn't a flaw in his system. It was a deliberate choice.
Interesting.
If Ibn Kathir was writing about Islamic law, what is halal and haram, or core theology, his standards were absolute iron. No weak evidence allowed in the courtroom.
Okay, so where did he use the weak ones?
In a category called fadail al-amal, the virtues of deeds, or moral exhortation.
Oh, like encouraging people to be good.
Yes. Classical scholars believe that if a hadith had a weak chain, but it didn't contradict any laws, you could use it to soften people's hearts. It is called shawahid, supporting evidence.
Give me an example.
If a weak story says people who pray at night will have faces shining like the moon, he includes it because it inspires people to pray.
But what happens when the story is terrifying? Like a graphic description of a punishment in the grave, or a bizarre story about how an ancient civilization was destroyed?
That is the core issue today. A scholar in the 14th century knew the technical difference between a legal proof and a moral story. But a modern person sitting at home, reading a translated English volume, doesn't see the technical Arabic footnotes.
No, they just read it straight through.
They read a terrifying, weak hadith, and they absorb it as absolute divine truth. They think it is binding law.
Because the warning labels are missing in translation.
Yes, and this creates immense anxiety for modern readers, especially when it comes to social ethics and laws. Because Ibn Kathir wasn't just writing abstract theology, he was writing commentary on how society should function.
And he was doing that in a 14th century Mamluk patriarchy.
Exactly. This is where modern reformist scholars like Fazlur Rahman or contemporary feminist scholars raise their biggest objections.
What do they say?
They argue that Ibn Kathir's interpretations of social verses are entirely locked into the politics and gender norms of his era.
Give me a concrete example of how the Mamluk culture influenced his writing.
Take verses regarding the relationship between men and women, or family law. The Quran establishes male financial responsibility. But when Ibn Kathir comments on these verses, he often expands them using the social assumptions of his time. He lived in a highly structured, male-dominated military empire.
The slave soldiers we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So his commentary emphasizes male authority, obedience, and rigid social hierarchies in ways that go far beyond the direct text of the Quran. He assumed a society that operated on strict dominance.
Because that was the only society he had ever seen.
Right. Same with warfare. When he comments on verses about engaging with non-Muslims, he assumes a world of constant imperial conflict.
Because the Crusaders and Mongols were his reality?
Yes. He does not envision a modern, pluralistic nation-state with equal citizens.
So what do modern reformist scholars say we should do about this?
They argue that by treating Ibn Kathir's commentary as if it is sacred and untouchable, the Muslim world is carrying a massive historical burden. Yeah. They argue that a 14th century Syrian scholar's views on gender and politics shouldn't be the final word on how Muslims live in the 21st century. They believe his commentary prevents the Quran from speaking directly to modern ethical issues.
But on the other side, the traditional scholars say what?
Traditionalists argue that if you throw out Ibn Kathir and the early generations, you open the door to complete chaos.
Because then anyone can say anything.
Exactly. People will just start interpreting the Quran to fit whatever liberal or conservative political trend is popular today. They view Ibn Kathir as the vital anchor that keeps the religion from washing away.
I want you, listening right now, to really reflect on this tension. Put yourself in the shoes of someone trying to apply this text to their life today. How do you separate the eternal, divine message of God from the 14th century social anxieties of a man living in Damascus?
It's incredibly difficult.
Is it even possible to respect this immense work without feeling like your ethics have to be frozen in the year 1370?
That is the defining question of modern Islamic thought. And academic scholars offer a third way. They call it al-ilm biolnock knowledge through critique.
Explain how that works in practice.
It means you don't burn the book, but you also don't worship it.
I like that.
You read Ibn Kathir as a masterful, unparalleled historical map. He shows us exactly how the earliest generations and the classical scholars understood the text. He is the ultimate reference library for Arabic linguistics and historical reports.
So you value the data he collected, but you don't necessarily have to adopt his 14th century conclusions.
Exactly. And this requires acknowledging a very important theological distinction, the difference between Tanzil and Tafsir.
Tanzil and Tafsir.
Yes. Tanzil is the divine revelation itself. It is flawless and eternal.
Right.
Tafsir is the human attempt to understand it. Ibn Kathir's work is Tafsir, is a brilliant, rigorous, monumental human effort. But it is still human. It is bound by the science and politics of its time.
That distinction between the perfection of the message and the limitations of the messenger feels like the key to this whole conversation.
He really is.
It allows you to admire the fortress he built without feeling like you are locked inside the basement.
It allows the religion to breathe. Ibn Kathir preserved the historical core. The challenge for scholars today is not to just repeat what he said, but to apply his rigorous dedication to truth to the realities of a world with globalized ethics, new social structures, and modern science.
We have covered so much ground today, from the trauma of the Mongol invasions and the smoky streets of Damascus, to the exhausting science of tracking narrators across continents, to the sun setting in a muddy spring, and all the way into the deepest theological debates about how we even dare to speak about God.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
It is. As we wrap up our time together in this courtyard and as the evening approaches, I want to leave you with something to really mull over. Think about this. Ibn Kathir's entire life was driven by an obsession with finding the untainted truth. He used every single tool available in his era to strip away falsehood. If he were sitting with us in this courtyard today, with access to modern cosmology, historical critical methods, and a vastly different understanding of the universe, would he write the exact same book? Or would his relentless, honest pursuit of truth compel him to see the text through an entirely new lens? May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.